Let's get started because Jesus is answering and asking a lot of questions. And one of the questions that arose back then was based off of a misinterpretation of a passage. And so I want to give you the question they get asked, and then I want to go to the passage that they were arguing about and kind of explain a little bit of the background. And so you start off with this idea. You start off with the idea of contentment. Am I satisfied with where God has me? Am I satisfied with what God has done in my life? Is He enough? That's the question. Now, obviously, there comes issues that get a little bit deeper, where you have to basically say, all right, what do I do in this situation? And there's a level where God says, in the perfect world, this is how I want you to act. But God is fully understanding of the fact that we do not live in a perfect world. So He has made some allowances. You think about it. There's a whole bunch of laws on when you accidentally kill someone. Okay, in a perfect world, nobody kills anyone. But every now and then, the guy sitting there chopping away at the wood, he flings his axe head back, the axe goes and kills someone. And it's like, well, what do you do in that situation? Here's the rule. And then every now and then, there's situations where people just will not listen. And so God makes up a rule to say, because you have chosen not to listen to me, here are some protections I'm going to put into place. And so some of the laws are not God's ideal. They're not what God wanted to be there. It's more or less Him saying, I'm dealing with humanity as humanity is, but I just want you to understand this is not the way it was meant to be. So what I want us to do is I want us to say, okay, we're content with what God has, but then we are seeking God's heart. And I want us to understand that as we go forward in this, that if we are seeking God's heart and God's desire on the matter, it's going to change a lot of how we behave. Like there's certain things that we would be allowed to do, but we wouldn't do it because we're looking at it and going, yeah, I know God gave permission, but I know it doesn't please Him to do that. It's kind of when I was a kid, there was a certain song my dad didn't want us listening to. And so he had made it abundantly clear, I don't want you listening to that music. And now, when I'm old and I'm out of the house, I can do whatever I want. I can listen to that song. But out of respect for my dad, I'm not going to listen to that song around him. I'm not going to like shove it in his face to be like, Dad, I'm listening to that song. Now, if I care about my dad, there's going to be certain things that even though I can, I'm not going to. So I want us to kind of understand that heart attitude. So that's where we are in Mark chapter 10. And like I said, we're getting to Mark chapter 10 here in just a few weeks with the morning service, and I'll address it in a different way when we get there. But I want us to start off, and look what it says. Mark chapter 10. He rose from there, and he cometh to the coast of Judea by the farther side of Jordan, and the people resort unto him again, and as he was wont, or as was his habit, he taught them again. So he's sitting there teaching them, and the Pharisees came, and they asked him a question of this. They said, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife? And they were tempting him, which means they were putting him to the test. Now, this is what I've explained in the mornings. I've said these questions were not actually sincere questions to get information. It was an honor test to see, like, let's see if we can stump you. And so Jesus isn't really even playing the game. And so that's why I want us to understand the difference in his answer to the Pharisees as opposed to the disciples who ask him a question in private. And I'm going to explain a little bit about the background of what was going on with the rabbis, because there's a little bit more stuff going on here than just, I'm confused about the interpretation of this passage. It's, which rabbi are you siding with? What side of the fight are you taking? Can you answer this question? And I want you to notice what Jesus does. He doesn't say, Rabbi so-and-so says this. What does he do? Look what he goes. He goes, what did Moses command you? You claim you followed the law of Moses? Okay, what did Moses say? And look what it says. And they said, well, Moses, and they even use that word suffered, which is he allowed it. He suffered them. He gave in. He let them have it. He suffered them to write a bill of divorcement and to put her away. Okay. So if Moses said that, what's the question? Seems pretty clear to me. And that's what he's saying. He's like, all right, so is it lawful to put away a man? Well, what does the law say? Yes? Okay. Now look what he adds. And Jesus answered and said unto them, for the hardness of your hearts, he wrote you this precept. And so they even almost hinted at it in the way they worded the statement. They said, he suffered us to do it. And he goes, yeah. It's because you guys had a hard heart, and he knew you were going to do it anyway, so he set up a system whereby he could mitigate the damage that was going to be done. So there you go. Hardness of your heart. I mean, he just nails them right between the eyes. Verse 6. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this cause, because they're male and female, shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. So there's something about the male-female relationship that he says there's going to be a unique aspect of this. We all understand what that means. Basically, you could potentially lead to the production of children, and because of the leading to the production of children and the continuation and the best way to do all that, you need to have these marriage covenants. You need to have these things in place. And so he says, because you got male and female and all the stuff that goes along with that, there you have it, that you're going to leave your family, go join, you're going to start a new family, and that's the system that was made. Jonah abandoned that. And that was his gist. He says, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, cleave his wife. They twain shall be one flesh. So they are no more twain, but one flesh. So there's no more two people here now anymore. You're one. And it's a mystery. We don't quite understand all of what that means. And he says that. It's a mystery. But the idea now is you've left your family. You joined their family. This is the pattern. This is the way it's supposed to be. All right? But he's admitting that not everybody follows this pattern. So we had to set up some rules to keep things at least moderately in order. But then he says this. He says, they twain shall be one flesh. So they are no more twain but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. And we say these on our wedding vows, and we have this as part of the ritual. Because the idea is, if God has seen fit to bring this and allow this marriage to come together, we do not willy-nilly, flippantly dissolve it. We treat it with the respect that God treats it. And that's the point. So that's why I come back to this idea. So the contentment says, I'm content with what God has done. I also seek God's heart on the matter, which he clearly, the Bible says elsewhere, he hates the putting away. It's the hardness of your heart that he allows this thing. But the very implication in those statements is there are exceptions. There are some allowances, but we understand the allowances are kind of very, very much less than ideal. Okay? So that's kind of where we are. And that's what he tells the Pharisees. And then he just walks away. Look at it. And in the house, his disciples asked him again. And so again, the struggle is real. It's kind of that, okay, that's all well and good, but I live in the real world, God. How do I deal with this situation? And so God goes, okay, let me explain just kind of the next step part. Because I know that there's going to be issues. I know there's going to be struggles. I've given you what my perfect plan is. I've given you what I desire. And all things being equal, this should never come up. But let's face the reality of the situation. There are various things that will come up that will sunder a marriage and damage it. And so the disciples, who, again, are probably fairly young men. It was interesting. Someone, I think Deb was pointing it out to me. They were probably fairly young, if not upper teens. They might have been younger 20s. I mean, so these are not old guys wandering around. And so you can think these are young men who are just kind of wrapping their mind around the teachings and really trying to process what's going on. And Jesus has the answers. And so naturally they're going to go to him and just say, I don't understand. I don't get it. And so look what they said. Verse 11. And again, in the house, the disciples asked him again after the same manner. And he said unto them. Now he didn't insult them for going, I just answered this question outside. He goes, I get what you're saying. I know it's not hardness of your heart that you're asking this question. I know it's a genuine desire to understand. So let me give you this one further clarification. And look what he says. He says, okay, whosoever shall put away his wife, shall marry another, he committeth adultery against her. And so he points it out. He says, okay, so there was this allowance for a man to, because he found something unpleasant about his wife, and there was arguments about what that meant. And he said, because of all the misinterpretations and arguments back and forth, let's just say this guy decides to put his wife away. He doesn't like her anymore. He divorces her, and he goes off and he marries someone else. He's like, that is adultery. There you go. Okay? But then he points out and he says, but if a woman put away her husband and married another, she committeth adultery. So if you're in this marriage and you basically go, I don't want to be part of this marriage anymore, and you just say, we're done, and then you go off and marry someone else, God says that was not a legitimate process. So here you go. That was not a legitimate use of the divorce process. So in that case, yeah, there's some adultery involved. And he leaves it. And then, again, there's a little bit more, he kind of changes the topic and goes off in a different direction. This passage is weighty and it's kind of frustrating and it's deep, but it goes back, and I want you to see Deuteronomy 24. Okay? So Deuteronomy 24 is specifically one of the passages he's referencing. Deuteronomy 24, again, it's the Old Testament law. Moses is processing through just a whole bunch of stuff. And what we need to understand is in this passage, Deuteronomy 24, it says, when a man hath taken a wife, and he married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes. All right? And so this idea is, what does no favor mean? And I spelled that terribly. I spelled favor. All right, so when you see this idea of no favor in his eyes, what does that entail? I mean, is that like, man, your breath really smelled this morning, and I do not favor that, so therefore, like literally, there were two rabbis that were arguing back and forth at this time. And one was basically saying, quite literally, if she burned the meal, that would qualify as disfavorable or something that was not, and so quite literally, if she burned the food, you could count that as something that was divorce worthy. Whereas another rabbi came along and said, no, this is referring to something like sexually deviant or something that she had done in more of a moral failure. That's what he means by no favor. But you can see, like the way Moses wrote it, when a man hath taken a wife and he marries her, and it come to pass that she found no favor because he found this uncleanness, and actually specifically the no favor comes from that word, uncleanness. And it says, well, what does uncleanness mean then? I cannot spell tonight. And he says, well, that uncleanness, so I found no favor because of this uncleanness. Look what it says. Let her write a bill of divorcement, give it to her hand, and send it out of her house. And back then, the way the laws were is quite literally, people were doing this thing where they'd divorce for the weekend and go marry someone else for the weekend, and then they'd remarry their, and it was like, that is not okay. But you got to understand, the whole reason this bill of divorcement was written up was, hey, we're no longer married, and Moses is trying to cut some things off of the past to say, you guys can't do this thing where you like go off on a marriage vacation for the weekend, and you go marry someone else, and you marry them for the weekend, and you divorce them and go back to your first wife after the weekend's over. And, well, we were married, so it's okay. He goes, no. That's not okay. You don't suddenly get over whatever this unfavorable thing was, and you're like, I was away for a weekend, I'm okay now. No. And that's what he says. He says if he found no favor because there's this uncleanness, he writes a bill of divorcement, gives it in her hand, sends her out of the house, and when she's departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. And if her latter husband hate her, and write her a bill of divorcement, and giveth it in her hand, and sendeth her out of his house. Or if the latter husband die, which took her to wife, her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife, after that she is defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. Thou shalt not cause thy land to sin, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. So what he's trying to do with Moses in these laws is to say, we're not going to do this whole like partner swap thing. That's gross. That's abominable. The idea, the pattern God gave is husband of one wife. This is the pattern he laid it out. Now, I know the Old Testament didn't hold to the husband of one wife thing too often, but the idea was we're not just going to say, okay, you sent away, swap in, and then that marriage fell apart, so you know what, I miss you, let's swap back in. Nope, it's one and done, it's over. But this idea of the writing of divorcement means if you were given a writing of divorcement, that was permission to go get remarried. That was the idea. And so that's what Jesus is commenting on. He's saying, listen, this whole idea of uncleanness or undecency, whatever that means, I'm not for it. You can't just keep swapping people. Like, you are getting involved in adultery here. So don't do this. And that's what we're looking at with this passage. And so when we talk about this idea of this issue, we've got to understand that just willy-nilly divorce just because of whatever actually entails some sin with it. So you can't just willy-nilly do it. But you'll notice there are going to be some exceptions that are built in. Now, Jesus is very specifically talking about a very specific circumstance, and that's why he words it the way he does. We see in Luke 16, all right? So look at Luke 16. There's another passage. All right, Luke 16 is another passage dealing with the same subject. All right, Luke 16. And so Jesus is talking about this issue, and that's where he says, hey, don't be willy-nillying. You can't just trade around spouses. You can't do that. That's not what God meant. But in Luke 16, we see another passage here. And I want you to notice Luke 16, verse 18. It says, he's in the idea of, well, we'll start off, the Pharisees in verse 14. The Pharisees also, who were covetous, heard these things, and they derided him. And he said, ye are they which justify yourselves before men, but God knoweth your hearts. So Jesus is being a little blunt with these people. He's saying, you guys are doing what you can to excuse your sin. You're justifying yourself, and I'm just calling you out for what you're doing. And so Jesus realized that the Pharisees were very impressed with themselves, and people looked up to the Pharisees. And he goes, no, I'm not for that. Really, a lot of kind of the modern day rabbinic stuff is there's a lot of Pharisaism in that carried forward. They would add traditions and add rules, and they would keep to those rules, and that's how they showed themselves to be godly. And Jesus is just coming along and saying, no, we're not playing that game. And he says, for that which is highly esteemed among men is abominable in the sight of God. The law and the prophets were until John. Since that time the kingdom of God is preached, and every man presseth into it. It is easier for heaven and earth to pass than one tittle of the law to fail. And then he says, all right, let's apply a principle from the law. And he says this, whosoever putteth away his wife and marrieth another committeth adultery. So he said, if you're just going to willy-nilly, flippantly put your wife away, again, because the argument was, yeah, go ahead, go for it. Like, uncleanness, just pick a topic and just divorce her and you're fine. He goes, no. Even though you technically got married to the next person because you didn't do it the right, you weren't living the way I was asking you to, that is adultery. And that's why he's bringing that up. He says, whosoever putteth away his wife, marrieth another, committeth adultery. And whoso is married to her that is put away from her husband committeth adultery. Because, again, this wasn't done according to the exceptions. This wasn't done according to the rules. This was you just flippantly choosing to break up a marriage. That new action was adultery. And he brings that up. And then in verse 19, he goes off into a different parable. But Jesus is basically just saying, I'm going to hold to what the law says. And you guys have added all your traditions and all your rules, but I'm not okay with that. All right? One other passage here, the same idea. Again, these are parallel passages. Look at Matthew chapter 5. I think Matthew chapter 5 gives us kind of an interesting wording that sheds some light on this struggle. Because again, this is a struggle. This is a hard thing. So we start off, like I said, we've got to be content with what God has for us and where God has us. We also have the idea of we're seeking God's heart on the matter, whatever the matter is, but today we're dealing with a specific topic. And then we've got to look and say there are times where the scripture is vague enough that we don't quite know what to make, and that's where some of these arguments come in. But if we're seeking God's heart, we're seeking to be content with where God has us. But then I'm going to add one little detail here, is true divorce involves the ability to get remarried. And to prove this, one, there's that passage in Deuteronomy that we looked at that said he puts his wife away, she can become the wife of another man. And so God is not saying that every time you get remarried after you're divorced, it's adultery. He's saying in certain occasions, in certain situations, or there might be an act of adultery, but you're not living in adultery once you're married to that new person, because the idea is you are genuinely married to that new person. That's a hard one to grasp sometimes, but I would look at the woman at the well. The woman at the well is a situation where Jesus is looking at this lady, and what does he say? He says, you've been married what? Yeah, so like 5 different men. That doesn't mean she was a polygamist. It meant she probably quite literally went through 5 different marriages, and then he points out and he says, And the one you're living with right now is not your husband. And so Jesus, in looking at this woman at the well, and we have to assume at least some of those probably ended in divorce because the culture of that day, one of the Roman senators, I believe, he bemoaned the fact that some women count their age in how many divorces they've had rather than in years. And he's like, this is a problem, guys. Like, stop it. But again, whether they were put away or whether they divorced, it's kind of like today. There was just kind of a disrespect toward the topic of marriage. There was a lot of divorce. There was a lot of putting away going on. And Jesus looks at this woman at the well and says, you have had 5 husbands. Which meant legitimately, whether her husbands had died or whether she had been put away and remarried, she had gone through 5 men, and Jesus said each one of those were your husband. And however it worked, whether they had the equivalent of common law back then or whatever, he's like, the one you're living with now is not your husband. And what did the woman say when she went back to the town? She said, here's a prophet who said all the things I've ever done. He knows my sins. He knows what I've done. And really, he doesn't say a whole lot. But she was like, you know exactly what I'm about. And so that's why I use this idea that a true divorce is the permission to get remarried. But the Bible points out you are not to be swapping back and forth. You can't divorce, marry, get divorced, and remarry. No, there's certain things we're not going to do that. So I want you to look here in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, and look at verse 32. Actually, we'll start off a little bit before this. So the reason I say this is a parallel passage to Mark 10 is because if you remember what we went over this morning, remember he was talking about offending the little ones and not going to hell and all that language. That's just before this in Matthew. So it's the same setup. He talks about your right hand offends thee, cut it off. Your right eye offends thee, pluck it out. It's that same language you see in Mark 9 that you see. And I want you to note that this little difference, okay? And it says this, you have heard him said, whosoever shall put away, let him give her a writing endorsement. So he's quoting Deuteronomy, that passage we just looked at, that said if you find a reason to divorce your wife, if you're going to do it this way, you're going to give her a writing of divorcement. Jesus already added his commentary to that passage to say the whole reason that passage even existed is not because I wanted it to happen, but because I knew you were going to do it anyway, and I wanted to make some protections for the wife, so that way she wasn't just being thrown around like a piece of property. So you're going to give her a writing of divorcement. You are going to send her out, and you're not going to just suddenly take her back when you want her. Like she's out of your area. You don't get her back. And so there's some of those things that Jesus is putting into place to say, this is the way the law read, and this is why it read that way. It would be like this. When I was a teacher, I had a rule for a while, know your mom jokes. And the reason I had know your mom jokes was because I knew my teenagers, and I knew some of the jokes that they would make. And so ideally, I would have never even had to have that rule on the books. But I knew my teenagers, and I knew what they joked and what they said things about. And so I just had to add the rule that said, know your mom jokes. And it lasted for a few years, and eventually I faded it back out. But I put it there because I knew they were going to say it, and I wanted to kind of warn them, if you're going to do this, this is going to be the consequence. Now, eventually it got to the point where I didn't need the rule anymore, and sometimes the rule was causing more trouble than it was worth. So I phased the rule out and just kind of did more of a warning shot. But God is writing to an entire nation, and he's saying, I know you're going to do this anyway. So I'm going to give you a rule, and I'm going to tell you how I want the rule handled. Okay? So Jesus is coming, and he's saying, I'm going to tell you why this rule was there. And he says, because of the hardness of your heart. So verse 31. It has been said, whosoever shall put his way of wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But, and this is where he clarifies, he says, I want to tell you the conditions at play here. Because in my eyes, as God, if you don't meet these conditions, this is the sin you're getting yourself into. Because you have flippantly decided to do this thing. And look what he says. Whosoever shall put away his wife, saving what? For the cause of fornication. Now, I know there's a lot of people who read into that and they're like, well, fornication is premarital, and so therefore this is engagement period. Okay, no, he's not trying to make that. He's just saying if there is adulterous behavior that is taking place, if you've got some sort of extramarital sexual behavior going on, And I believe the word behind this is porneia, which is, again, just a broad meaning of sins. He says, if you're going to put her away, except for this sexually related sin, causeth her to commit adultery. And I think that's a really interesting note, because he's basically saying, listen, if she's already committing it, it's not your fault if you divorce her, because you're not causing her to go off and do it. She's already done. I would reference something like Hosea, all right, to be tasteful and not to get too deep into that weed. Hosea is a situation where he marries a woman who is of that caliber, and the idea is she chose to go off into that. It's not Hosea's fault. Okay? And that's the idea. He who puts her away because she's involved in this sin, if she's not involved in that sin, he is causing her to go commit that sin, because she's going to have to go get remarried, and God says, there you go. All right? And then it says, whosoever shall marry her that is divorced also committeth that. And so again, you see a lot of these passages here. All right? Now, again, there's an umbrella term. There's a lot of that. We're in Matthew. I want you to hop forward to Matthew 19. Matthew 19. Okay? We're just walking through what the Bible has to say. We're noticing the specific language, because, again, some of the exceptions are baked into certain stories, but they're not baked into other stories, because they didn't fit in the narrative that story was telling. So if I am telling you the exception, so if I get up as a teacher and I say, I don't want you talking in class, we all understand there are going to be exceptions to that rule. There are going to be loopholes. There are going to be times where I lift that restriction. But generally speaking, my attitude toward you as a student is don't talk during class, because I'm talking. But then there's times where I am quite literally going to stop what's going on, and I'm going to say, any questions? And you can't suddenly go, well, you said don't talk in class. No. The whole reason I didn't introduce the exception was because everybody already understood. There were exceptions, and we understood the time. So Mark is going to say certain things. Luke is going to say certain things. And what we do is we come back to this idea that I'm content with where God has me. I'm seeking God's heart on the matter. So I'm not flippantly just doing this thing. And that's why Matthew hints that there is an exception for something sexual that happens that you go, I can't live with this. And so he gives you that allowance. All right, Matthew 19. Look at Matthew 19 and look at verse 7. Actually, we'll just start off in verse 3. It says, and the Pharisees came to him tempting him and saying, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? So you can see this conversation kept coming up because they kept trying to get him to take a side. And this is specifically, any cause is she found no favor because of uncleanness, and they're going, uncleanness, that means burnt the toast or sneaking out. One or the other. Which side do you go on, Jesus? And that's where Jesus again reinforces this truth. He says, have you not read that he that at the beginning made them what? Male and female. And he said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, they twain shall become one flesh. Wherefore, they are no more twain, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. So he's accentuating one more time how important this relationship is. And he's saying, don't flippantly dissolve it. However, verse 7, they said, why did Moses then command the document? Why did Moses allow it? And he says, well, Moses did it because of the hardness of your hearts. That's why he suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, whosoever put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and marry another, committeth adultery, and whosoever marrieth her that is put away doth commit adultery. So he's putting in this one exception clause, and he's saying this is the one clause, this is the one situation where I'm going to basically say, yes, I get it. There's some situations that arise with this one situation that will give you that permission. But look where he goes further, because he's already said, I hate it. He's already said, you don't flippantly do it. He's given us examples in Scripture of people who have lived through that betrayal. And he's saying, like, ideally, you live through it, you work through it, you try to reconcile, but I get it. I get it that there's going to be some situations here. But look what he says, verse 10. His disciples said unto him, if this case be of a man with his wife, it is good for him. It is not good for him to marry. It's really funny because if you study out the cultural trends of today, A lot of young men are not getting married because they realize the absolute burden and danger that getting married costs them. Because again, a lot of the courts, a lot of the other things are going to side against men. And there's a lot of young men who are like, I'm not willing to take that risk. I'm not getting married. And it's interesting that we're kind of back to this location, because look what happens. When you've got these young disciples, and again, remember, these are upper teens, young 20s, they're young, they're inexperienced, and they're looking at this going, if I can't divorce a woman for like anything, I don't think I want to get married. And that's the attitude a lot of people have today, where they're just going, I just don't even want to risk it. Okay? And Jesus is trying to say, like, be careful what you enter into. Be careful, because again, this is a really, really serious relationship. And he says, but he said unto them, all men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. And then he just points out, he's like, there's some men who don't need to get married because, metaphorically speaking, they are eunuchs. They don't need to have that relationship, but not everyone's like that. So that's what verse 12 is all about. All right? And he says, he that is able to receive it, let him receive it. And so this is, again, there's a lot of these texts. All right? And again, I want you to remember the gist that we've looked at. God is for marriage. He's for the relationship in marriage. That's why he designed marriage to work the way it does. He also designed some of these to protect the woman, so that the man can't just send her away, bring her back, send her away, bring her back. He's basically saying you're not going to treat her like that. Same with the woman to the man. You're not going to treat the man like that. You're going to have this protection built in. He also looks and says, if it is a true divorce, then there comes with it that ability to get remarried. But if that marriage dissolves, you're not allowed to go back to your first one, because that's just confusion. It's weird to be like marital yo-yo, going back and forth. Don't do that. Okay? And some of that, again, it comes back to God's pattern. So we start off with the idea of being content where God has me. We look at this idea of I'm going to seek God's heart in this matter. And then we're going to say, you know what? There could be some vagueness in this language that the rabbis love to argue back and forth on. Jesus makes it clear. The whole idea of divorce was put in place because he knew how we were. He knew how our habits were. He knew how our families worked. He just knew our hearts and said, I'm going to set up some rules to keep this from going even further off the rails. And that's the language he lives. All right. Let me show you. So that's what Jesus had to say on it. Okay. I also want to understand that, like I said, there's some exceptions built in. We looked at the exception of adultery / fornication, but I want you to look at one other exception here. Look at 1 Corinthians 7. 1 Corinthians 7, this is a passage we looked at. And again, we're coming from God's heart. And we're saying, in a perfect world, in an ideal situation, this wouldn't even come up. You take care of this before you get there. You take care of this. There's forgiveness. There's whatever. But we all understand there are times where selfishness has happened. Certain sins have happened. Again, God understands. Think about after the flood. What did he say? I understand that man is but dust, and I will not destroy the world with a flood again. So he destroys the world with the flood one time, and then he says, you know what? I'm not going to do it like that again. Next time I'm going to use fire. But what is this? He's saying, I understand the frailties and the weakness of man. So there we go. I'm going to make some allowances here. In an ideal world, you wouldn't have spouses that are of different faiths. But let's face the fact, that's how the world works. It could be because you married someone who wasn't saved and you were saved. It could be that you got saved after you were married and that person didn't follow along. And so Paul is writing here because in the early church, you have a lot of people getting saved and their spouses aren't. And so the ladies are the ones, a lot of times, that were getting saved and their husbands weren't saved, and they are trying to be a good testimony to the husbands. But again, there's this weird flippancy toward divorce. And Paul is acknowledging that and saying, all right, ladies, you're saved. Your husband's not saved. Let's deal with the realities on the ground, because again, it might not be an adultery thing. There might be no sin involved in him walking away on you. What do you do? And if you're in that situation where your husband walks out on you and you're going, how do I take care of myself? How do I do all this? Am I allowed to get remarried? And what do I do? And that's why Paul points this out. Look at 1 Corinthians 7 and look at verse 10. It says, and unto you married I command, and he goes, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. So you're married, you're a believer, your husband's not, don't walk off on her. And he acknowledges, he understands, that's going to be a hard choice, that's frustrating, and there's all the hardships and difficulties that come along with that. But he says, don't leave. He says, but, so he's talking again to both men and women here who have unmarried spouses, unsaved spouses. He says, but, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried or to be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. So if you're a saved man, you don't put away your wife. If you're a saved wife and your husband puts you away, hey, just basically wait and let's see if we can reconcile this thing. Okay, so there's some of that language here. He goes, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. So Paul is understanding that there's a level of just, he's giving his advice here now. So the first section, he says, this is from God, but I'm going to give my little bit of commentary to kind of help you understand God's heart on this. And he goes, hey, don't put away your wife. And he says, but, again, don't put her away. Verse 13, and the woman which has a husband that believeth not, if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. Okay? For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else your children were unclean, and now they are holy. And it's basically just saying that God's blessing can reside on a house, even if only one of those spouses is saved. It's not saying suddenly everyone in the house gets saved, but it's just saying there's a level of blessing that you can bring to your household if you are the saved spouse and you are just staying faithful and doing your work. God understands the sacrifice. He understands the hardship that is that, and he will bless you in that. Okay? And he says, but if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. And so what he's saying, and again, this is painful. This is not a pleasant thing to talk about, but it just ties into this topic where he's saying, if you have an unmarried spouse if you have an unsaved spouse, and that spouse says, I don't want anything to do with you, I'm done, and walks out, you can let them go. And he says, let him depart. And it says, a brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases. So that's where it's just interesting. He's saying, you're not bound to your husband if he has chosen to walk out. Now, the ideal is you can sit, you can try to reconcile, and you try to make that thing right again and all that. But he goes, no, that doesn't always work that way. He's being very real with how the real world works. And he's saying, there's just aspects here. And he says, but if the unbeliever depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? But as God hath distributed to every man, and as the Lord hath called everyone, let him walk, and so ordain I in all churches. And so what is his point? He says, listen, God is going to give grace in this situation. It's a very hard situation. We don't downplay it at all. We don't make light of it at all. We understand the seriousness of this situation. And Paul is saying, if you have a husband that has walked out on you and he has left, he has called you to peace. He has not called you to bondage. And so there seems to be an allowance in this situation to say, if the opportunity arose because your husband abandoned you, because you were not a believer, because he was not a believer, you are free. And the very fact that he says you are not called to bondage seems to imply that you are free. But you need to treat that very, very carefully. You don't just flippantly go into it. And so I want us to kind of understand that language of freedom and not under bondage and peace, that seems to be kind of that second exception. So again, we've walked through a lot of these texts. There's a lot more we could walk through, but that's kind of your main issue. But I want us to understand the seriousness that God has for this topic. Now, we can walk through a few other exceptions. We just don't have time tonight, and I don't want to take us much longer. But again, this idea of, you look at the lady, the woman at the well, there seems to be, and even Deuteronomy, there seems to be the permission of remarriage. But we need to take that carefully. And really, with the exception of the uncleanness in the sinful sense, there does not seem to be exceptions to the case of divorce, except for the unsaved spouse that walks out. That seems to be the exception. Now, obviously, death is a very obvious exception, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking divorce here. And so those seem to be the two major exceptions to the rule. And God has laid it out very, very clearly that it's not his desire, it's not his plan, but he is dealing with the situation as it is on the ground. Now, I realize we haven't talked about the issue of abuse. We'll deal with that at some other point, because there is a situation where there is abuse, and there seems to be an allowance in some of those cases to say, God has called us to peace. He has not called us to bondage. There seems to be a level where there could at least be separation for a while as legal situations take place. God is not asking us to put ourselves in a situation that is deadly for us. And so there are some allowances to get out of the dangerous situation, let things sort out, try to reconcile the best you can. And so there are some of those, but again, we just don't have time to get into that topic tonight. We'll see when we get into that one. So again, I wanted to address kind of the divorce topic all kind of at once. It is something we're going to get into in Mark 10, probably not as deep as this. I want to take it a different way once we get to Mark 10 in the morning. But I did want to address all these issues kind of in one fell swoop. So questions. I realize this is a weightier issue. Questions or comments tonight as we wrap up this issue? Just Lauren, I think the handheld's muted.
Yeah, there were two churches down in Southern California, and one of the two pastors on two separate churches basically wife swapped. They both got divorces, and the odd thing is how the two churches ended up merging, so you could see what a mess this is. So with that being said, I mean, it's just like I was saying last week, a lot of this is ignorance and tolerance for sin.
Yep.
But I guess my question would be more of, in a situation where a Christian to a couple gets a divorce because they say, oh, it was unfavorable. In other words, I just didn't like being with that person anymore.
Yeah.
There was no adultery. There was no walking out. It was just, I just don't want to be with that person anymore. Okay, they go get married to somebody else, and everybody just accepts it. They don't look at this as sin, and it's just like, oh, now they're married, and we'll just sweep it under the rug. But for me, it's like, that's like saying, okay, I'm going to drink and drink and drink and drink and get drunk, and what you name the sin.
Yeah.
So my question to you is like, how do we look at this when you have two Christians that came out of it, in that situation? They're just in this marriage.
So I'll explain it like so when I was going over the qualifications of a deacon. Okay, qualifications of a deacon are husband of one wife. Okay, so the question naturally arises: is a deacon allowed to be divorced? And there are great arguments back and forth. I've had pastors who are like, absolutely not. I take the idea that yes, you could theoretically have a deacon who's divorced. I have absolutely no problem with it, and here's why. Because that, especially if that deacon has shown a long track record, so if they got divorced before they were saved, or if they got divorced 30 years ago and they've been married to the same person, I look at that and I say, okay, you have now shown the qualifications of a deacon and a pastor are basically saying you are a faithful man. It's not saying you've never made a mistake. It's not saying you've never committed a sin. It's saying you're a faithful man who is not flirtatious and randomly wife swapping. So that's why I look at the case of a deacon to say, or something like that. It's the quality of the character of the man, not necessarily a statement on whether he's ever been divorced. That's my opinion. People disagree with me, and I'm okay with it. So for that situation, I'd say that kind of shows a disqualifying aspect, specifically in the case of a pastor. Because if you have a pastor who is living in such a way that the Bible says if you're not taking care of your own household and you're pastoring and you can't take care of your own household, you actually are disqualified from the pastor. So I would look is if a pastor gets divorced and then immediately remarried to the wife of a different pastor who also got divorced. Like, I know there's more to that story probably, but But just on the surface, you're basically saying, I can't keep my house in order, and so it fell apart. And then I'm immediately going to go out and remarry someone else's wife who just divorced her husband. Like, there's a lot of disorder there. And so that's where I would look at some of those situations and say, okay, that man is probably disqualified from being a pastor because he cannot keep his own house in order, and because quite literally he just divorced and remarried. That's disorderly, and so that's where I look at now. If it was a common church member who was struggling and they struggled with their relationship and they got divorced, that's a whole different issue. That's a complicated issue, to be sure. This is why, and the argument comes back, and I don't have a great answer for it. People ask, so if it's adultery to remarry someone who's been married before, is it an act of adultery, or is it now a lifestyle? Like, if you live like a married person with that person you married, are you living in an act of adultery? And I don't think that's the case, because I don't think God would bind us in such a way that says, therefore, I mean, you are legitimately married to that new person. Like, that is a legit marriage. I believe it was an act of adultery, and I don't think it's a lifestyle of adultery. Because God basically says you need to live like a married person if you're married, with all the implications that go along with it. But again, people argue back and forth. But I think it comes back to, in the case of the pastors, I think if a pastor were to get divorced and remarried, you'd have to know the full story. But I think the general consensus on face value would be that that is a disordered situation and should not be the case. So I don't know if that answers your question. But hey, all right. Any other questions or comments on that one? Okay. Again, I deal delicately with this topic because, again, I know nobody goes into it going like, oh man, I just so want my marriage to end like this. But we understand in the reality of the world as it is, things happen. And God is asking us to take it seriously. And that's why even to those who aren't married, they've got to be careful with who they marry, because God is not for the putting away. And it can't just be like, irreconcilable differences. And so therefore, because let's face it, marriage, any of us who are married, you have irreconcilable differences with your spouse, even to this moment, where you're like, we just kind of agree to disagree on this one. It's irreconcilable. We're not the same person, so we're not going to look at these things the same. That's not an excuse for a divorce. It's not even an excuse for separation. All right, it's saying, work through it. I like the way one person put it. They said, one of the worst pieces of advice they've ever heard someone give a married couple is don't let them get away with it. And so this is a person who counseled tons and tons of marriages, and they said that was one of the worst pieces of advice they'd ever heard anyone give it, is don't let them get away with it. Because they're like, if you're a married couple and you're in this together and you're working together toward an end, there is a level of forgiveness and looking past things that you have to have. And that forgiveness will sometimes involve you letting things go. And that's this whole study we've been doing on marriage, is there is a level where you just have to let certain things go. And it's the idea that you're not going into the problem, you're not going into the argument trying to figure out how the other person is wrong. Because you will always be able to find out that the other person is wrong. I was chatting with someone and they brought up the idea of narcissism. And this person brought up the fact, they said, we've all dated narcissists because we're all narcissistic in some way or another. We're all kind of full of ourselves in some way or another. So the idea that you have met someone who is very impressed with themselves, congrats, you're dating a human. And it's just that idea of we need to understand that they have their opinion, we have our opinion, they're not going to reconcile, and we do what we can to bring peace between us. But Jesus is bringing out the extreme examples to say, yes, I get it. There's some very extreme examples that are very hard to overcome. Ideal world, we overcome them. Realistically, there are some things that are just too hard. And so that's where we treat it with that level of seriousness. All right. Any final questions or comments?